Alright, so it should come as no surprise to most of you that during World War II, statistics were made on the operational effectiveness of military aircraft. Such statistics were important not just because each nation needs to know how many aircraft it had operational at any given point in time, but also for logistics, what kind of equipment or parts had to be replaced and so on. Now, during World War II, around 1943, the United States also decided to research aircraft survivability and try to find ways to improve the survivability of their aircraft based on post-battle analysis. A survey was conducted looking at all the aircraft coming back from missions. The basic idea was this: find out where aircraft were damaged the most on operational flights and strengthen those specific parts of the aircraft. Pooling the numbers and figures, the group conducting the survey came up with something like this. Based on the evidence gathered at the front lines from returning aircraft, they gathered that parts of the wings, the midsection of the fuselage, and parts of the tail were especially vulnerable to enemy fire. After all, it was here that most damage was located, and it seems to add up at first glance. However, you might realize the fallacy of such methodology. Back in the day, so did a Hungarian mathematician that had fled to the US from Austria in 1938. He concluded that the survey did not hold up to scrutiny. In fact, the researchers had fallen into the common trap that we nowadays know as survivorship bias. Survivorship bias, also known as survival bias, is an error of logic. It concentrates on entities that have successfully passed a selection process, whilst ignoring, usually due to a lack of visibility, those that did not. As such, it often leads us to draw the wrong conclusions. Abraham Wald, the mathematician I have mentioned, offered an alternative. In his mind, it was exactly those parts that seemingly saw little damage that must be strengthened. He argued that the aircraft that came back might have sustained heavy damage, but since they managed to return, this damage did not matter too much. Those areas were sufficiently protected or simply less likely to influence the plane's ability to return to its base. His recommendation was to strengthen the protection around the engine and fuel tanks, as well as the midsection of the fuselage. Here, little damage had been registered by the researchers, exactly because the plane that suffered such damage had not made it back. In hindsight, this actually makes sense. For example, if you have ever picked up a book on German fighter squadrons or pilots of World War II, you'll notice that pilots often mention that they are focused on specific, vulnerable parts of enemy planes and bombers. They might indeed aim for the defensive gunners on occasion, but the killing blow was usually delivered to key parts of the enemy aircraft, like the engine, fuel tanks, or the cockpit. The midsection of the fuselage was also a weak point on many aircraft. In fact, most pilots of all nations will confirm this standpoint. As Abraham Wald mentions himself in his paper from 1943, undoubtedly, the probability of downing a plane by a hit will depend considerably upon the part that receives the hit. Wald even went further than this. He started to mathematically evaluate the destructive capabilities of several different weapons against different parts of the plane. Evaluating and comparing flak, 20mm cannons, and 7.9mm machine guns, one of his conclusions was the following. This analysis of the hypothetical data would lead to the conclusion that the plane is most vulnerable to a hit on the engine area if the type of bullet is not specified, and is most vulnerable to a hit by a 20mm cannon shell if the part hit is not specified. The greatest probability of being destroyed occurs when a plane is hit by a 20mm cannon shell on the engine area. The next most vulnerable event is a hit by a 7.9mm machine gun bullet on the cockpit. These and other conclusions can be used as guides for locating protective armor and can be used to make a prediction on the estimated loss of a future mission. Now, of course, all of this is based on mathematical analysis, so there might be some difference from real-life events. Wald really brings us closer to reality than the first research group ever did. However, back in the day, the research group that had published the initial recommendation had most likely very little knowledge of fighter tactics or had not been given the opportunity to speak to some of the crews. I am also not sure how much influence their original study had, since next to Wald's publication, it has apparently never been published. Now, survivorship bias is something that occurs quite a lot, even nowadays, and can even impact our daily lives. Relying too much on statistical solutions can lead us to the wrong conclusions. There is already plenty of reading on the subject for those that are interested. As for Wald's paper, It was reprinted in 1918 by the Center of Naval Analysis, before being declassified sometime later. As the introduction of this reprint notes, next to World War II, his methodology had been employed in the analysis of data from both the Korean and Vietnam Wars. It is published by the Center of Naval Analysis not only as a matter of historical interest, but also because the methodology is still relevant. Now I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you want to see more content on my channel on military aviation, consider checking out my Patreon. Support over Patreon allows me to get the resources for future content, such as books and other materials, and it directly influences my ability to invest time into the channel. Just $1 or $2 already make a big difference. When you leave, make sure you pass by those like buttons on your way out, and to share this video with your friends. And if you want to know more about armor and aircraft, check out this video. Or if you are interested in learning about ammo counters in World War II aircraft, click right here. As always, I hope you have a great day, good hunting, and see you in the sky.